For our first function in example 3, we've now added a vertical shift. Notice that we still have not added a horizontal shift, but we're just going to look at what happens with a vertical shift. So we still have a horizontal and vertical stretch or compression happening. So we still want to find the amplitude, which would be 2. The period would be 2 pi divided by that factor of 4, which is then pi over 2. And then we finally have this vertical shift. And remember from the beginning summary, that vertical shift, or that D, is what is called the midline. So if you have a midline that's not just 0, I want you to write down that midline. So that midline, and remember I want it as an equation, is just going to be the horizontal line, y equals that number. So what that means is, instead of having my midline be on the x-axis for sine and cosine, it's now going to shift the entire function up to y equals 3. So when we did not have a midline, our amplitude would go to the positive 2 and negative 2, or whatever amplitude we had. This time, the midline is affecting what our maximum and minimum values are going to be. So whenever I have a midline, I like to write down what the range of my values would be. With a midline of 0, our range would just be plus or minus the amplitude. But when I have the midline, that changes. So this is an important note to write down. So the range of a sinusoidal graph is basically going to be my midline, or my D value, right, from the summary, plus and minus the amplitude. Okay, so if my midline is at 3, then I'm going to go up from that midline 2 values, and I'm going to go down from that midline 2 values. So my range, instead of being from -2 to 2, is the midline plus or minus 2. So my range is going to be 3 minus 2. It's going to have a small value of 1. And then the largest value, we're talking about range, so we're looking at our y values. My largest value is going to be 2 above the midline, which is 5. So we're going 2 below the midline to 2 above the midline. So this is important to do so that when we're setting up our tick marks, before sine and cosine were centered around the x-axis. They went the same distance above and below the x-axis. Well, now our midline has changed. So if I'm only going from 1 to 5, then I can better know how to set up my tick marks. So that means I'm not looking at any negative y values on this graph. So when I set up my graph, I'm just going to basically look at the first quadrant instead of doing a symmetrical top and bottom half of my axes. So I'm going to do the y-axis first. So I know I have a bottom point of 1, and I'm going to go up to 5. So since 1 to 5 is not that big, I'll go ahead and do 5 tick marks. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I mainly just want to label the lowest point, the midline, and the highest point. And so the next thing I want to do is draw kind of a lightly dashed line at the midline. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I know that this is where my graph is going to be centered around, instead of being centered around the x-axis like we're used to. Okay, so just in your mind, just kind of shift that axis up to that 3. So that's the midline right there. Okay, now we still are going to do the same thing that we did before on the horizontal axis. So on the horizontal axis, we still do not have a horizontal shift, which is good. So that means we're going to be starting our cycle at 0, and we're going to be ending our cycle at the period. So our period this time is pi over 2. So we're going to go from 0 all the way to pi over 2. So we're going to be fitting one cycle there. And so then, just like we did before, I'm going to go halfway. So half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. I'm going to go halfway again to pi over 8. And then halfway in here, if you count, this is 1 pi over 8, 2/8, and so this would be 3/8 pi. Okay, or again, you could always take the average of these, the midwall and the period, to find that 3 pi over 8 as well. Okay, so now you have all of your axes. So now we're going to graph sine. And so the basic shape of sine, remember, sine starts on the midline. So our midline is at 3, so the sine graph is going to start at 3, and it's going to start at our beginning point, which we started at 0 because we had no horizontal shift. So we're going to start on the midline at that 0 mark. And so since sine, this is positive, so sine goes up, so it's going to go up to its highest point at our next tick mark, then back to the midline, then down to its smallest point. So we set our ranges at 1 to 5, so it's going to hit at 1, and then back to my midline, and then there is my basic shape graph of sine. Okay, so really nothing changed about my shape. All we did was just made sure and shifted that graph up. You can still see we have an amplitude, kind of a radius from that midline of 2. In example 3, part B, we finally have the phase shift, or a horizontal shift. So before we start with this one, let's go ahead and write out all of our pieces of information. So our amplitude is still 1, but notice that we are going to be reflecting across the x-axis. So all that means for cosine, we're going to be starting at the negative amplitude instead of the positive amplitude. Notice that in front of the x, there is no horizontal stretch or compression because we still have this factor of 1. So we don't have to worry about that. But we do have minus pi over 2. So that means we're going to be shifting to the right pi over 2. And what we call that is the phase shift. So let's go ahead and write that out. So our phase shift, and I like to say left or right. So remember, if you're inside the argument, inside the parentheses, you're going to be doing the opposite of what you think. So if you see minus pi over 2, we're actually going to be shifting to the right. And so we're going to be shifting to the right pi over 2. And then finally, we do have a change in midline. So our midline is going to be at y equals -4. All right, so we still have a lot going on. So let's first talk about what happens with that phase shift. So normally, in all the other examples we've done, sine and cosine have always started at 0. So then what I did is we started at 0, and then we looked at our ending point, which would be the period. And actually, let's go ahead and put the period. The period was not affected, but we still know the period is going to be 2 pi. So instead of ending at 2 pi, if I shift to the right pi over 2, that means my cosine graph, instead of starting at 0, is going to start at pi over 2. So it's going to end at pi over 2 plus 2 pi. So let's write that down. So we're going to end at my phase shift, because my phase shift is like my starting point. Okay, so when you see phase shift, I want you to think of that as your starting point. So if you have no phase shift, you're starting at 0. So I'm going to end at my phase shift plus my period. And we've already done that, right? Because if we started at 0 and added my period, then I ended at just my period. Okay, so the end of my cycle, so end of cycle, is going to be my phase shift plus my period. So for this one, my phase shift, the starting point is going to be pi over 2, and then I add 2 pi. So if I'm find a common denominator, then you're going to be adding 4 pi over 2, so you're going to be ending at 5 pi over 2. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. So you start at pi over 2, you end at 5 pi over 2. So those are 2 of your points. You still have to find the middle 3 points. Now, with a denominator of 2, it's not that difficult to do your math with your fractions, but I want to show you another way to do it. So this is kind of like option 1. You take your start, you add your period, and that's where you know you're going to end. Another way that I like to do it is I like to take my start. So this is how you would find your 5 tick marks. So 5 tick marks. Okay, so before we would start at 0, then our period, and go halfway. Well, you can't really do that here when you have a phase shift. So my starting tick mark is going to, of course, be my phase shift. So pi over 2. And actually, let me draw this out again as a note. So you're going to take your phase shift, and that's your first tick mark. Okay, then your second tick mark, you're going to add, so you're getting 5 tick marks, but you're really looking at 4 sections. Think of them as like your quadrants. So each of those is going to be a 4th of your period. So if I add a 4th of my period, and we can see this on our original graph, right? So if our period in our original graph is 2 pi, what's a fourth of 2 pi? Well, pi over 2. So each of our tick marks, we added a pi over 2. Okay, so that's another way you could do it, is you could take your phase shift and add a fourth of your period until you get to your 5 points. So actually, let me rewrite that 2 pi as the period, because that period is going to be different for each of the following graphs. For this one, it just happens to be 2 pi. Okay, so to get your 5 tick marks, you start with your phase shift, and then you keep adding a fourth of your period. So in blue is kind of like the note, the general, and then in black, I'm going to have the 5 tick marks. So pi over 2 plus a fourth of our period is 2 pi. So we're going to add pi over 2 plus 2 pi divided by 4 is pi over 2. So we're just going to keep adding pi over 2 until we get to the 5 points. All right, so let's see what this looks like. So remember with a midline, like we did in example A, we want to write out what the range of our graph would look like. So our range, remember, is going to start at my midline and go up and down my amplitudes, so plus or minus 1. So my range is going to be from -5 to -3. So we're only going to be looking at that bottom quadrant. So I have -1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So really, I just care about the maximum point, the minimum point, and the midline, which would just be -3, -4, and -5 here. So remember, my midline is at -4, so we're going to draw a dashed line, and that's what my cycle is going to revolve around. And now let's do our tick marks. So now that we have a phase shift, we're not starting at 0, so that does not count as one of our 5 points. So my first point is going to be my phase shift. That's always my starting point, is my phase shift. So I now have a starting point at pi over 2. Now, 2 ways you can do this. You can go ahead and put my ending point of 5 pi over 2 and then find the halfway marks that way. Like I said, with this example, that's not difficult because pi over 2 is not a difficult fraction to work with. But when I get more complicated fractions, I like this other method better, which is finding my 5 tick marks. So you start with your phase shift, and then you add a quarter of your period for five times, right? Or 4 times until you get 5 tick marks. So a quarter of my period, 2 pi, is pi over 2. So I'm going to add pi over 2 to pi over 2 and get 2 pi over 2, which is pi. 2 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2, or pi. Plus another pi over 2 is 5 pi over 2. Okay, like I said, I know that kind of seems a little ridiculous by adding like that with the pi over 2's. I'm just trying to give you the method for when we're dealing with more complicated fractions, which we're going to see in the next example. All right, so now we're going to draw our graph of cosine. So we're looking at cosine. So remember, cosine starts at its amplitude. And since it's negative, we're going to start at the negative amplitude. Now be very careful because we're not at 0 this time. We're starting at pi over 2. So our starting point is at pi over 2. Cosine is going to be at its amplitude, and we're starting at its negative amplitude. So we have a lot going on. So our starting point's at pi over 2 at its negative amplitude. Okay. Then we're going to come up to the midline at the next tick mark. So the next tick mark's pi, and we're going to be at the midline. The next tick mark, and we're going to be going up to the opposite side of the amplitude. Moving along, my next tick mark, I'm at the midline. And then my final tick mark, I'll be back where I started at that -5, that negative side of the amplitude. Okay, so that's how you get it, and then we're just going to graph cosine. So it's going to look like this. Okay. So again, just as a reminder, when you have a phase shift, that's where you're going to be starting your graph, and then make sure you're seeing those 5 points that are equally spaced apart. And I just happened to notice a mistake, my bad, that should be 2 pi. Yeah, sorry. So that's good practice so that you can go back over and make sure that your tick marks do in fact make sense. And each section in your tick mark should be a fourth of your period. So since my period is 2 pi, then every single section should be a length of a fourth of that, or pi over 2.